One of the things I told my wife Diana when we got married was words, something you'll probably never hear me say to you, is at a mealtime, this was just not as good as my mom made it. Now, you need to understand, my mom was a good cook, but she was a very basic cook, and she did the best she could with what she had, which was not much to start out with. And in our house, we learned very quickly that whatever didn't get finished at one meal ended up reappearing someplace else in a different form, and probably not even tasting quite as good as it would have tasted the first time. You know, food that kind of sits in the fridge for a while kind of develops a certain flavor. In fact, I grew up not really liking stew, because stew was invariably made up from, the leftovers that were kind of gathered throughout the week and then thrown into one pot, mixed a bit of gravy and thrown it together and then putting it over rice. So when my wife made stew for the first time, I was shocked at how good her stew tasted. It tasted a whole lot better than the stew that I grew up with. When you don't have much to start out with, you learn to live on leftovers, whether you like them or not. We've been going through a story of Ruth, and we've reached that point where they have arrived back in Bethlehem. And one of the things that they're going to learn is, because they don't have much to put together when they arrive back in Bethlehem, they're going to have to learn to live on leftovers. Their arrival had caused quite a ripple effect through the town. Here, two women are traveling alone, which was a very unusual thing in that time. If women didn't travel, it was very dangerous for them to do that. And it began to the word began to spread through the town that these two women arrived, and after a little bit of while, a few minutes, they begin to recognize that one looked strangely like somebody who'd left there about 10 years ago, and that was Naomi. And so the word began to go around, and of course, the conversations, I'm going to step out on a limb here and probably offend some people, the conversations that women have sometimes about each other. They look and say, is that Naomi? I think she's lost a lot of weight. No, she's gotten really gray. She looks a lot older than we remember her. And by the way, where's her husband? And when she left you, she had two boys. Where are they? And who is that woman traveling with her? The word began to spread around as they began to talk about what she looked like, who she was. And at some point, Naomi must have overheard some of the conversations, because she responds back. And she says, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. For God Almighty has made my life very bitter. Well, chapter 1 that we looked at, which is a bit of a downer to go through because a lot of tragedy taking place, ends up on this positive note. And so the last verse in chapter 1 reads something like this. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law. And then this is the foretaste of something fortunate happening, something good finally beginning to take place, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So that was the closing verse there of chapter 1. As we get into pick it up in chapter 2, we have these questions that kind of arrive out of that. Where were they going to stay? Did they have family left? Would family even let them back in? I mean, after all, they had left there for the terrible land of Moab, and that would have felt like a bit of a betrayal to their own values. But even beyond finding a place to stay, how would they put food on the table? So when we pick up in chapter 2, we kind of keep on reading. Now, one of the things that when we read our Bibles as we have them today, we sometimes forget that the numbers of chapters and verses were added in many thousands of years later, actually, because they were first added in around the 13th century. And then kind of the Bible that we have today was probably, verses and chapters were numbered in about the 15th century. But when the narrator, the storyteller, is first telling the story, he or she would have gone straight from one chapter to the other without that kind of break. Sometimes we lose that sense of continuity from one chapter to the next when we have that break, and then we go away, and then we come back and pick up in chapter 2. But listen how it reads when you read it together. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain. See the flow that's going on? And all of a sudden you have this one verse standing in there giving you some information about this man named Boaz. And if you're listening to a story for the first time and you don't know how the story is going to play itself out, you're beginning to say, why are you mentioning this guy at this point? There must be a point to that. And there is. It's preparing the way for what is to come down the road. The storyteller is giving us enough information to draw us into the story. And the storyteller has not given, leaves a lot of things open-ended. The storyteller never condemns any of the actions that the people take place, although the original audience might have. So when Elimelech chooses to go to Moab, they would have said, well, that was wrong. When Elimelech dies, soon after they arrive in Moab, they say, well, that was God's punishment. When the boys then get married to Moabite women, they would have, the original audience would have said, well, that's terrible. They should never do that. And when they die after a short time after that, they would say, well, that's God's justice. But we notice that the storyteller never draws those conclusions. And one of the things I've mentioned before is sometimes when we read into the text God's actions that aren't explicitly said there, it often says more about us than it does about God. Because I suspect that those of us who think of God as judgmental and condemning very likely are that way in our own personal lives as well. Those of us who operate and live by grace or see God as a God of grace will no doubt practice that in our personal lives as well. The art of storytelling here is to leave things open so that you begin to identify with some part of the story. You're drawn into it. You begin to identify with one or more of the characters in the story. And you get drawn in and you begin to live the story yourself. Jesus was the master storyteller, wasn't he? He would draw people into the story, and then his stories would all of a sudden take a certain turn, and you'd be left saying, oh, I don't know if I really want to be that person anymore. Anyway, the storyteller here gives us enough information to begin to set the context for what is to come along the way. They've arrived in Bethlehem. It's at the beginning of the barley harvest, which stands in contrast to when they left there because there was a famine in the land. And Ruth begins to thinking, we got to do something to put food on the table. And so she makes more of a statement actually than a request to Naomi. And she says, I'm going to go out and start picking up after the leftover barley. Someplace along the way, she would have probably found out, either been told by Naomi or learned from asking around what was taking place, that the laws of the land that God had given the people way back when in Moses' time provided for the provision for food for the people who were marginalized and poor and not able to provide for themselves. So in Leviticus 19, 9-10, it says, when God gives this command, he says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over the vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. And then God says, I am the Lord your God. And when we read the same statement as Moses gives it in Deuteronomy, which is really Moses' memoirs, he says, don't forget that you once were slaves. In other words, don't forget that once you were down and out as well. God says, I'm the Lord your God. I provide for you. I'm the one that brings everything good into your life. I want to work through you to provide for others. Well, Ruth apparently had become aware of this possibility, and she decides to act since the barley harvest itself usually only lasts for a few days to a week. And it needed to be harvested when it was ready. I have memories of living in Saskatchewan and when I was going through school and seminary. And I worked my way through school by driving tour and charter bus and coming in late at night on a late summer evening and seeing the combines out in the fields. because when wheat fields were ready to be harvested, the farmers all got together and worked together as a community to get the crop in, lest a late summer hailstorm or downpour damage the field and they don't get a crop in that year. So here they have a short amount of time to get the barley harvest in. She's aware of that, and so she decides to take action and to go out and to do that. Now, she's probably also had heard some of the stories that in spite of this ruling that God had given his people, not everybody complied with it. And so there's some who found different ways to get around it, and she'd heard those stories. Gave me pause to reflect about how we live in Canada sometimes. Canada is seen as the land of opportunity, and we have people, we take in refugees from different parts of the world, and that's the way we should be. We should be practicing that grace and that welcoming presence to people. Unfortunately, not for everybody is the story a happy one when they arrive here, and they find instead that they are marginalized and don't get provided for in the same way that they expected. And so Ruth had heard that, so when she says, let me find somebody whom I may find grace, in other words, find somebody who will favor me and say, it's okay for me to do that. And so it says, she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. Then it goes on to say, the storyteller goes on to say, as it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And here we find out, okay, this is why Boaz was mentioned first. There's something going to take place here. We're not sure what yet, but something is going to happen here because this person was mentioned earlier. He's a family member, although at this point, neither one of them really are aware of that. As it turned out, as it so happened. Makes it sound like it's by chance, doesn't it? But the storyteller wants us to understand that God doesn't work by chance, but by opportune moments. It's a reminder that God is at work behind the scenes through ordinary people as they go about their ordinary lives. So what about you? Have you experienced an as it turned out moment in your life? I can remember a few in my own. I can remember one in particular. It was about 2 or 3 years, I think, into our marriage, and things weren't going good. We were kind of in a rocky road, and it was my non-Jesus following days, and it was not going well. And I chose to do what Naomi did. I chose to go home. My home was in Ecuador. And I have this vivid memory of getting on board the plane in Vancouver that was going to take me to Toronto with a stopover in Winnipeg, and then I would change planes and fly on to Miami and then on to Ecuador. As I got on the plane, it was a 737, so you got the 3 seats, and I'm thinking, I really hope, like everything, nobody sits in that middle seat beside me. I don't want to have anybody close to me. I want to mind my own business. I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm kind of deep in grief here about things that are taking place in my life that are falling apart. I just don't want to be around people as much as I can avoid it. But of all my rotten luck, remember this is my non-Jesus following days, this guy sits down beside me. And he turns around to introduce himself to me. And not only is somebody sitting there, but he turns out to be this youth preacher evangelist. And I think, man, why? Why? This is, I have to admit, I was probably extremely rude to him, made it very clear that I was not interested in talking about anything religious or spiritual. I was very grateful when he got off in Winnipeg. But before he got off that plane, he turned to me and he says, Don, I want to leave a book in your hands if you promise me that you'll read it. I have an obsession with books. I love books. I was going to be overnighting in Toronto. I needed something to do. I said, sure. So he put a book in my hands. I stuck it in my carry-on, got to the airport where I was staying overnight, pulled it out, tried to read it. Honestly, it didn't make sense to me. It didn't interest me at all. I stuck it away. My wife will testify to the fact that I don't throw anything out. And Diana, here's proof why you should never throw anything out. It wasn't until about 1 or 2 years later, we had, fortunately, God's grace at work, worked things out in our lives and our marriage. And I was beginning to feel a certain amount of spiritual restlessness. And all of a sudden, for whatever reason, it triggered in my mind, I had this book someplace. And I pulled it out. And the book was the very thing that I needed to read at that. It was written by a Christian philosopher called by the name of Os Guinness. Great man. The book was called In Two Minds, on the subject of doubting. It was exactly where I was at that point in my life. I was at best an agnostic and wasn't sure God was there at all. And as I began to read it, it began to answer some questions I have and make it okay to have questions that didn't have answers. By the way, the name probably won't make a whole lot of sense to many of you because you're not old enough to remember him. But the man who signed the book was a man by the name of Terry Winters. The epilogue to the story is I met up with Terry Winters several years later at a fundraiser for his, he was an evangelist, and he was doing a fundraiser. I met him at the door, and as I went up to talk to him, I said, "You probably don't remember me," but he interrupted, and he says, "On a plane from Vancouver to Winnipeg." I thought, wow, I must have been really rude. I had the privilege of working with him in a campaign when we were living in Prince George as well. It was one of those aha moments, one of those as it turned out, one of those divine appointments that God put somebody in my life along the way. As it turned out, God works in the ordinary things of life. Never be afraid to have that simple 2-minute conversation with somebody, because as it turns out, God may use that to connect somebody in a real way. The writer goes on to say, just then, and you alerted now again to the fact that here's another as it turned out moment taking place. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. So Boaz arrives, and he greets the people. It's easy to pass over this greeting and simply dismiss it as kind of a very traditional greeting. I grew up Latino. A common greeting that we have, especially among Christians, is to say, Dios le bendiga. We greet each other, we say goodbye to it, as God bless you. And it's easy to think that this would be just a traditional thing without any depth of meaning. But in this story that we're reading here and we're studying here, the storyteller uses fully about 3/4 of the verses that she writes, or he writes, writes them in the form of dialogue. And so you begin to be aware that any dialogue alerts you to something else taking place. And so when Boaz says to him, to the people that are working there, "The Lord be with you," he's acknowledging the fact that God is present in the very ordinary part of work as they do go about their menial and tough job of labor of harvesting the barley. And when they return back and say, "And with you as well," they're recognizing that God has blessed him so that he can bless them with the work as well. There's a sense that sometimes we forget the fact that God is at work in the ordinary parts of life as we go through our everyday lives. Now, I'm not saying that you should go to work tomorrow because it may not be so well received by your working companions to say the Lord be with you. But acknowledge the fact that at least that when you walk into your place of work or your place of study or wherever you go, that God is present there. He's already there. You know, sometimes we say we take Jesus with us. The truth is, I've discovered, I think Jesus is in the world waiting for us to arrive so that we can join him in what he's already doing when we get there. Ruth, I just lost my place here, but I'll keep on going. But in the story here, then we acknowledge that God is at work. And in the labor of not only of the harvesters, but in everything that is there. But then Boaz very quickly takes notice of this woman that's off in the distance working away. And he asks the question, whose young woman is that? Who does she belong to? Now we need to understand that in that time, a woman either belonged to her father before she got married or to her husband when she got married. And so a woman who didn't belong to anybody, a woman who belonged to nobody, was in essence a nobody. Notice the foreman's reply. He says, she is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. Now I want to stop here and take pretty much the rest of what we're going to talk about, reflect on what is taking place in Ruth's life, her situation in life and how she's working it through, because I think there's things that we can learn about how we handle life as well. This is now the third time within 6 verses that Ruth is identified here as the Moabitess. 2 times by in the words of the storyteller, 122 at the end of the chapter 1, and then 2 verses later at the beginning of chapter 2, she's referred to again as though we may have forgotten that. And then she's identified as such in the words of the foreman, who probably wasn't necessarily using it in a complimentary factor. There will be 3 more times in the course of the short study that Ruth will be referred to as the Moabitess. And added to the reference of her as one of the Moabite women that the 2 boys married for reasons not disclosed, the storyteller keeps it in front of us that she is basically an outsider in the land where she is living now. She's not from here. And for most of the others who show up in the school, she is not one of us. Now, 2 things that come to my mind as I reflect on that and spend time thinking about that. One is related to Ruth, and is that the challenge for her is now to live out the commitment that she's made to her mother-in-law, Naomi. That is, she said, your people will become my people. Now, she may want to be one of them, but the question is, will they want her to become one of them? Will they want her to belong as well? Will they allow her, invite her to belong to them as well? The second thing that comes to mind brings it home to each one of us in our own time. See, all of us are somewhat ethnocentric to some extent or another, but we probably don't fully realize it. The question is, who are we keeping out of our circle of friendship and relationships because they are not one of us? Who are we keeping out simply because they don't belong? They're not from here. Now, Ruth eventually does become one of them, although perhaps not fully in her lifetime. And here's a spoiler alert before we get to the end of the book. She becomes the great-grandmother of the greatest king of Israel, King David. And that may have been one of the purposes in this telling the story to begin with, that the storyteller is trying to draw this connection between the time of Judges when there was no king to the time when the greatest king that Israel had recognized came to power. But not only that, and this is something that the storyteller would not have been aware of, nor the original audience, is that she shows up eventually in the family line of none other than Jesus himself when we get to Matthew. Her identity, but back to Ruth here, her identity, who she is and her value as a person was not only determined by being a Moabitess, an outsider, but also that of a widow without any children, and in particular without any sons who could look after her. In the eyes of her social times, her social culture times, she lacked value. And when Boaz is asking, whose young woman is that? Note, she is a that. She's not even a person. And then in other words, the way it says clearly in some translations, who does she belong to? And of course the answer is, to nobody. Which in turn, in the eyes of those living those times, like I said before, made her to be a nobody. You see, the value of a woman at that time was determined by the value of her father, who he was and what his position was in society, or by that of her husband. She was owned, so to speak, by a man, either by her father before she got married, or by her husband after marriage. Which is a bit of an aside. When I officiate at weddings, I ask couples, can we change that traditional question? Because, you know, the traditional question is, who gives this woman to be married to this man? and we use it, and we don't understand the implications of it. The implications is that daughter is owned by her dad until she chooses to relinquish that ownership and give it over to a husband. The reality is, when you speak to the woman, you're not owned by anybody. You need to be owned by yourself and by God. And so I ask, can we change that to instead ask, who gives their blessing on the marriage of this woman to the man? And I hopefully want to see parents from both sides answer that in a very affirmative sense. Yes, we do. Ruth's identity, who she is and the value attached to her, is at the lowest part of the social ladder in her time. She is a childless Moabite widow who doesn't belong to anybody. Go downtown East Side, and you will encounter any number of Ruths living on the streets of Vancouver. And just as it was in Ruth's time, so it is in ours. We can make laws that are there for their protection, but the reality is the laws of the land don't have the power to change the condition of the heart, do they? Only God can change and transform our hearts. And we witness that, we see that throughout our time in the systemic racism and prejudice that takes place in spite of the laws that we have there to protect the marginalized people. A life principle that should be part of our lifestyle as a follower of Jesus is that of caring and looking after those in need, not out of obligation or in obedience to any kind of command or law, but out of a heart that has filled with compassion that has been transformed by a personal encounter with Jesus. But back to Ruth again. As I have read and reflected on Ruth's story this time, I've come to see Ruth as an early pioneer in women's rights, way back when, some 3,000 years ago. You see, in the eyes of her time, she may have belonged to nobody and therefore been a nobody. And in her time, that might have been the fact. But Ruth chooses to take the opportunity to redefine who she is on her own terms. Although she never quite comes out and says it in so many words, Ruth now belongs to herself and her newly found God. And she chooses, and this is an important aspect of thing to do, to choose, to take responsibility for herself, to discover what her new identity was, to discover how she could live that out. And that would be a learning experience for her, not one that just took place in a moment of time. Another thing I noticed is that in contrast to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who was supposed to be the godly follower woman that she was, who had at least this point surrendered to her perceived perception, her as understanding of her new identity as a childless widow, she had become just this angry, bitter old woman. By the way, here's a lesson to us as well in terms of the tough experiences of life. You have choices to make along the way of allowing it to make you bitter, or you can let God work through it to make you better. But here we have the situation that Ruth decides for herself that she's going to do something about it, starting with what is within the realm of possibility for her, but as we will see next time, pushing the envelope, so to speak, into what is considered even the norm and acceptable for her to do. She essentially takes responsibility for herself and refuses to allow her past experience or the labels that others have used to define her and to allow that to define who she is. Something I've noticed about Ruth, again in contrast to Naomi, is that she never blames anyone else for her situation in life, not even God. Nor is she sitting back expecting someone else to step in and do everything for her. She no doubt is experiencing the same level of grief in many ways that Naomi was. She lost her husband as well. But she's determined not to get stuck there. These two are some important life lessons that we can learn from Ruth. And so here she sets out to glean in the fields and does so very industriously, and even gains the perhaps grudging admiration of the foreman, who may have wished that his own paid workers were as industrious as she was. Because he says to Boaz, when she asks who she is, she went out into the field and has worked steadily from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now, we're not sure why, nor are we told why she catches the eye of Boaz when he arrives on the seat. But the conversation he proceeds to have with Ruth says volumes about his character as a man. There's much that we can learn from that as well. He doesn't speak to her in condescending tones or words. He speaks to her with respect and conveys dignity and offers to take on a protective role which she needed at the time. It should also be noted, as I said before, that neither one of them are aware that there's a family connection between the two of them. Her response then is one of humility. It says she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she exclaims, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Well, listen to Boaz's response, because it's equally telling. He has heard all about her and what she has been doing for Naomi. Even when she was not aware that others were watching her, she was being watched, and people were taking notice of that. Same thing is true for us as we go about our ordinary everyday lives. You're being observed. People are taking note. You may not be aware of that you're being watched, but you are. By the way, if you're a parent with small children, you're being watched very carefully. And if you ever want to know something, learn something about you, and it might be one of those, "Thank you for telling me what I didn't want to know," listen to your children when they're at play, when they don't know you're watching them. You may hear yourself talking and doing things that you might be shocked at. It is who we are in those times when we are not aware of anybody watching us that determines actually who we really are on the inside. But there's one more thing to know about Boaz that doesn't come through in this story, but we find it out much later on, actually, when we get to Matthew. And that is Boaz's mother is a woman by the name of Rahab. Now, you may not be familiar with the story, but back when Joshua was preparing to lead the Israelites into the promised land, he sent spies to the city of Jericho to spy it out, to figure out how they could take that city. His spies got found out, but Rahab was the person who protected them, hid them, and had them help them with a safe escape so that they could return to their people. And she did that, negotiate in turn. He says, "Well, when you come," and she already was aware that they were going to win that battle, "would you take me with you? Would you protect me?" And they did that. They honored that. And Rahab knew what it was like to be an outsider coming in from outside and trying to learn to be accepted, or get to be accepted by a new people, a new culture. I think Rahab taught her son well, because Boaz would have probably heard the stories from his mother Rahab about what that was like, what her experiences were like. And just put another side, and this is why you need to be willing and transparent and vulnerable enough to tell your story sometimes. Because your story, including, as probably even especially, those tough points in life, the hard points, the most painful points in life, and how you've weathered those and come through them, that part of your story is going to be most effective in touching the lives of others. So let me encourage you not to guard yourself, not to put up the walls about your story. I hadn't planned to say this, but listen, if you can't be who you are in church, I think there's only one other place that I think that happens, and it's usually after a few drinks in the bar. You know, that place where everybody knows your name. Church should be the place where everybody knows your name, knows who you are, and accepts you for who you are, and loves you for who you are, because that's what we've experienced from God through Jesus Christ. Let me bring this in. We're kind of out of time. I will pick some of this up later in 2 weeks when we come back. But I want to finish by asking a couple of questions here. Things here that we're learning from both Ruth and Boaz. One is, the question that comes to my mind is, what is your sense of self-identity? How do you define yourself? Or what have you allowed to define who you are today? Are you defined by some traumatic past experience? Are you defined by some hard thing that you've been through and that has labeled you for life? Have you accepted the label somebody else has put on you? We need to learn from Ruth that we need to learn to define ourselves and understand who we are, first of all, in the eyes of God. Each one of us is a human being created in God's image. Matters little gender, matters little of any kind of orientation it has, matters little about your ethnic background, matters little of who you are, your social, economic standing. We are all created in the image of God, and that ascribes worth and value to us. And we should ascribe that to each other and treat each other with that kind of dignity. Take responsibility for who you are. Become the person God has created you to be. But the other thing I think I learned is from Boaz. And that is, how are we treating others who are less fortunate than ourselves? How have we been transformed by a personal encounter with God, with Jesus, in such a way that we are naturally compassionate and caring? Are we taking the time to hear somebody's story before we pass judgment on them? Behind every face, behind every action, there's a story. There's a life story. Nobody woke up one day and said, I'm going to be a drug addict. I'm going to be a thief. I'm going to be a prostitute. I'm going to be. There's a story. And if we care enough about the person that's behind the story, we'll listen to the story. And hopefully at some point can become the presence of Jesus in that person's life that helps them learn to live a different story than the one that they've bought for themselves. One last question here. How have you, or are you, experiencing God at work through your life? Can you identify any it just so happened moments in your life? See, Jesus once said, my Father is always at work. God is always at work around you. The question isn't is God at work? The question really is, do you see that? Are you aware of that? Do you perceive that? Jesus goes on to say, I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees the Father doing. As you go through this week in your everyday, ordinary life, look for where ask every morning, wake up in the morning and say, God, you're doing a lot of things in this world around me that I don't know about and I don't see, but would you open my eyes to discern where you might be at work in the lives of others? May you open my eyes to see the invisible people, the people that I pass by every day but don't take notice of. Maybe I should be taking notice of them. Is there some place that you want me to join you in what you are doing today? Father, thank you for the encouragement that we can find in the life of Ruth, that regardless of who we have defined ourselves to be in the past or others have defined us to be, we're somebody else of great value and great worth in your eyes. Thank you that you've shown that to us, how much you value us through the love that you've poured out in our lives through Jesus Christ. May we live that out as we go through our everyday, ordinary lives this week. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.